presentation starts, and that helicopter noise shouldn't probably be something you can hear, so don't worry. That's why the picture is kind of moving, because a helicopter is, not stationary.
Yes, that will go away. My
microphone is
having some issues today, apparently.
That's why it's fun writing fiction, Annie. You can just make stuff up and just go with it, because who's going to argue with you?
Absolutely. All right. That ticker is still going up, and Tigger is still with us, but not on screen anymore. There he is.
He heard that. He does like to be the center of attention, like one of the presidents on this list. But in any case, he is going to sit over to the side right now. Thank you. Yes, Leslie, there is a feedback sound like a buzzer, but it is, we know it is behind Annie somewhere, and it will go silent when I start the presentation, not to worry.
Yes, so I apologize for any technical things that you are hearing. That will go away as soon as I finish this introduction. So thank you for being here, Gary. Tonight, or this afternoon, we have our last session of the Evolution of the American Presidency series. So we'll round that up just in time for the new year. If you haven't had an opportunity to, you can register for Gary's January series or new program that is beginning in January. It is a series on the Civil War. So you should have the handout in your email. I'm going to go ahead and put the link to register for that program into the chat so that you can register for that if you haven't had an opportunity to. And as always, we'll take questions at the end. You can use the chat function or the question and answer. I see that we have quite a few people on YouTube with us, so you can also put questions there if you have any. All right, enjoy the rest of the program. Take it away, Gary.
Okay. Today is the final session of our year-long series on the evolution of the American presidency. And we are going to cover the final set of presidents, which is Jimmy Carter through Donald Trump. In some ways, this is the most difficult of the programs to present of the 6. And the reason is this. It is difficult to evaluate the impact of a president on the presidency when that president is too close to now. In other words, it's the difference between news and history. You need a little perspective. It is impossible to have perspective on Donald Trump. It is difficult to have perspective on Barack Obama. We are starting to get some perspective on George W. Bush. And this isn't surprising. History takes a while to understand the nuances and the impacts, the long-term impacts, etc. So this is not surprising. So when we get near the end of the sequence of presidents, there will be less to say because of that. Now, I spent a lot of my time, of course, discussing politics and foreign policy. And from that perspective, since we're talking about the now and the future, there's a lot to say about Obama and Trump. But for this series, there is less to say, although, of course, there's a lot of interest. So just keep that in mind as we get to them. We have a highly rated president in this grouping, and that would be Ronald Reagan, who ranks number 9 in the C-SPAN ranking of presidents. And we also have, without a doubt, one of the most frustrating presidents to talk about, which is Bill Clinton, for reasons you can probably anticipate. On the second page of the handout, and if you don't have it or haven't printed it, I'm going to talk you through it just a bit. I did a bit of a retrospective, starting with George Washington and going through. I gave the presidents kind of categories for their orientation. And the most recent presidents, starting with Harry Truman, because Franklin Roosevelt's in a category by himself, Harry Truman through Lyndon Johnson, I use the word dominance, and that refers to the way that they managed the presidency. This is where the imperial presidency really took hold, starting with Franklin Roosevelt, then continuing through Johnson. Then I have a group of presidents which gets into the current group we're going to talk about today. And I've called that internationalism, where these presidents are more aware of the connectedness that we have with the rest of the world, whether it has to do with safety, whether it has to do with the economy. They seem to be more aware of it and more willing to act upon it. Donald Trump is in the final category, and he's by himself, and that is under the America First category. But keep in mind that Donald Trump is not the first president who's had an America First perspective. We have had other presidents like that. First, America First being a variation of isolationism, not equivalent, but a variation. And for that perspective, Trump is relatively unique in that we haven't had a president like that in some time. There's also on the second page a question, which I have brought up a few times before in this program, and I want to be sure that you think about it today and after the program is over. What is the role of Congress? The president can only expand authority and expand influence if Congress is willing to withdraw and step back. And many of the Congresses, particularly for these presidents and since Truman, have been willing to step back and let the president expand, which also makes the president more vulnerable. The key example of that, and we talked about it when we talked about Lyndon Johnson, had to do with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Remember that the Congress is supposed to declare war. We went to war in Vietnam. There's no question about that. But the Gulf of Tonkin resolution allowed the president to essentially act as if we were at war without the congressional resolution. So if these are the two sources of power and the president is going forward, part of that is allowed because the Congress is stepping back. There is some difference in that relationship when we get to Obama, and we are actually going to talk about polarization today also, because that is part of the evolution of the presidency as well. But I want you to think about the role of Congress. It has changed over the years. It used to have a much larger impact on many of the presidents, less so now. I also have my personal rankings for the presidents, the ones that I think deserve to be ranked in the top 5. It is a surprise to no one that Abraham Lincoln ranks number 1, but those are my opinions, and it is different than what you will see if you go to C-SPAN. Let's go to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter ranks number 26 out of 43, just a little bit below the midpoint in the C-SPAN ranking. I want to state that I admire Jimmy Carter more than any other living American. What he has done with his life, particularly after the presidency, I find to be highly admirable, and I really, really think a lot of him as a person and former president. His presidency, however, didn't go so well. There's a reason he was a one-term president. Some of it he did to himself. Some of it was the environment in which he was in. But he comes into the presidency having been the governor of Georgia. Georgia, by the way, is one of those states where you can only be governor for one term and you cannot succeed yourself. So he had been governor of Georgia, but that was the extent of his experience. And he made a couple of critical mistakes when he gets to Washington. First, most of the people he puts in his inner circle are people that he brings with him from Georgia. They have state experience, which is different than national level experience. Now, I am generalizing. That's not every single person. But he brought a Georgia contingent with him, and they weren't familiar with how Washington operates. And whether you think Washington operates positively or negatively, it does help to have some people who understand how it works. That, for example, would be a reason why George W. Bush selected Dick Cheney to be his vice president, because Cheney was a classic insider. So was Rumsfeld, which gave Bush a leg up in understanding the politics and how to try to get things done in Washington. But going back to Carter, so he brings a number of people from Georgia. That didn't help him. And the second thing was he immediately butted heads with Tip O'Neill. Tip O'Neill was the majority leader in the House of Representatives, or the Democratic leader in the House, depending what year it was. And Carter said to O'Neill that it was his intention to lead the nation, that he was going to roll over Congress. That was a paraphrase. It may have been a quote, but it was certainly a paraphrase. Roll over Congress to get his objectives accomplished. That's not the way to start a relationship with someone as powerful as Tip O'Neill. And you're going to notice a great contrast in terms of what Ronald Reagan does. So Carter sets up a roadblock where one was not necessary. On top of that, Carter also had a characteristic that got in the way. His characteristic was what we would call micromanaging, similar to President James Buchanan, who had the same weakness. Carter literally believed that every piece of paper that went across his desk was something that deserved his attention, his reading, his understanding, and his response. Well, the president gets a whole lot of papers going across his desk, and to try to do every one isn't really advantageous. So we have a president who has set up a barrier with Congress, who's brought people that are not particularly experienced in how Washington works, and wants to micromanage the flow going across his desk. If we put those into a mathematical formula, the answer would not be particularly positive. It's not that he did everything incorrectly. He established the Department of Education at the cabinet level. He established the Department of Energy at the cabinet level. And it wasn't Carter's fault that OPEC decided it was time to punish the West, hold back on the supply of petroleum, and create all of those lines at gasoline stations that we certainly remember. To an extent, it's similar to what happened to Herbert Hoover, who didn't create the Great Depression, but he happened to be the president when the Great Depression took place. When those lines formed at the gas station because of OPEC, Carter was the president, and therefore Carter got the blame for that. He didn't do it, but he suffered from it. And then near the end of his presidency, when the Iran hostages were taken, Carter was also saddled with that, and that caused him, among other things, to become a one-term president. So his impact on the evolution of the presidency was relatively small. He tried really hard to bring peace to the Mideast. He brought Begin and Sadat to Camp David and spent a number of days with them and hammered out a sort of a peace agreement between the two of them. Other presidents have tried to do that, including Clinton. And that was certainly a worthwhile and admirable effort. But in terms of an impact on the presidency, he just wasn't effective enough. The fact that C-SPAN even ranks him as high as 26 is a bit surprising to me. Remember, I said I respect him, but his presidency, not so much. Brent Scowcroft, who knew him very well and served him in office, said about Carter that his personal qualities were extremely admirable. His honesty, his faith, his devotion to his wife. We've seen some presidents who weren't quite as devoted to their wives, and we're going to see another one too. Sorry. We're all admirable qualities, but they don't transmit into leadership. Leadership isn't the sum of your personal characteristics. It has to do, to an extent, of projecting a vision that people want to follow. And when you talk to the American people and you tell them that they're failing, which Carter did in a famous broadcast from the Oval Office, and that they weren't up to the challenges that America was facing, it's not going to be perceived as particularly good leadership. So Carter's presidency flows through. Impact on the evolution, not so much. He is regarded, by the way, as a very brilliant person. I'll assume that's the case, but that brilliance didn't transmit into leadership. So He passes his 4 years in office, and he is succeeded by someone who had a tremendous impact on the presidency, and that would be Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan embodied a particular political point of view: fiscal restraint, tax reduction, love of country, love of religion, and the American way of life. And one thing that Reagan did was he said, these are my beliefs. I believe that America is good, which was kind of a contrast to Carter. And these are the beliefs that I'm going to use to guide my presidency. That resonated with America. So he was kind of a change from Carter. He certainly was a good communicator. And let's hold on that for just a minute. We all know that Ronald Reagan was an actor. We all know that as an actor, he was used to reading and memorizing lines, communicating effectively, giving essentially good speeches, and that's all true. But remember, in that C-SPAN ranking of presidents, communication is one of the 10 rated characteristics. And in that, Reagan rated very, very high. So Reagan didn't write his own speeches. No president in the certainly since FDR has written his own speeches, but his sincerity in delivering them had a real impact on the American people who looked at him as a leader. Now, Democrats who opposed his policies, of course, look at Reagan in a very different way. But remember, the C-SPAN summary from the historians has him ranked in the top 10, has him ranked as number 9 because of the things that he accomplished. Let's focus on Tip O'Neill for a minute. Reagan gets to Washington, and there's certain things that he wants to do. He wants to constrain the size of the federal government. He wants to rewrite the tax code. He wants to be strong against communism in a more effective way than Carter was strong. And here is Tip O'Neill. And remember that any legislation that has to do with finances has to begin in the House of Representatives, which means O'Neill and the Democrats are going to have an ability to shape that legislation for presentation eventually through the Senate to the president. So Reagan, who was a skilled negotiator, decides he needs to develop a relationship with O'Neill. And he finds out that O'Neill likes beer. Big surprise. He's from Boston. He's Irish. He likes beer. Well, that's a surprise. So Reagan begins to invite him over on Friday afternoons to kick back, have a beer, and let's talk about legislation in a very relaxed and informal setting. Now, we sometimes think of Reagan as a bit of a more formal person in his perfectly tailored suits and perfectly tied ties, but in fact, he was very comfortable in more relaxed environments, as was O'Neill. And Reagan had a wonderful approach to negotiation where he would say, I don't expect to win a negotiation. I expect to get some of what I want. I expect the other person to get some of what they want, and we'll both be happy. And then sometime later, we'll sit down again and we'll negotiate again, and maybe I'll get a little more. So Reagan was never upset if he didn't get his way, didn't get all of what he wanted, as long as he got some of what he wanted. So this becomes interesting in assessing his presidency, because although he wanted fiscal constraint and he wanted reduction in taxes, the fact is that the federal deficit grew during the 8 years of his presidency, partly because O'Neill said, if you want to have some more money spent on the military, which Reagan did, then I'm going to want some more money spent over here on this support program, this federal program. And Reagan would compromise and give in. Reagan could honestly say, I got some of the stuff that I wanted, but so could O'Neill. It didn't change what Reagan focused on, what was important to Reagan. When he called the U.S. the last best hope of Earth, which was, of course, a paraphrase from Lincoln, Reagan actually believed that and believed that to be true. wasn't as important to O'Neill, but it was to Reagan, who was very consistent. Reagan becomes a cheerleader for democratic values, and the American people like that. They like to hear that, again, partly because it was contrast to Carter. So the first 4 years that Reagan is in office, he makes considerable strides getting to the point where he wants to be. His management style was very, very laissez-faire. And we're going to talk about that when we get to Trump, because we're going to talk about the 5 classic styles of leadership. We're just going to talk about Reagan's for the moment. Laissez-faire essentially says, I know that I'm the leader, but all of you have important assignments, all of you cabinet secretaries, and pretty much I'm going to let you work it out amongst yourselves. Here's kind of where I'd like to go, but you guys figure it out and I'll be fine. As a matter of fact, Reagan took that to an extreme, because when 2 cabinet people would come to him and they would say, okay, we've got this problem, we can't resolve it, we want you to make a decision for us, Reagan would typically step away from that decision and say, no, you guys go figure it out and come back and tell me. He didn't want to offend or hurt either one. A difference from Carter, and something which is more acknowledged with the more modern presidency, is the chief of staff that Reagan picked for his first term, James Baker. Now, James Baker is an absolute Washington insider who has been involved in many different administrations, who has always been effective, whether you like his politics or not. He has always been effective. And he was Reagan's chief of staff during Reagan's first term in office. He stepped away from that for the second term. During the first term, Reagan was very, very effective, in part because Baker was the person who Carter didn't have, who said, let me take that paperwork, let me prioritize that for you, Mr. President. Here are the 3 things you have to look at today. Here they are. Here are the 3 things we need to know what direction you want to go in. I've taken care of that other fluff that you don't need to see. Reagan, because of his laissez-faire approach, was more than comfortable doing that. Baker helped him a lot during his first term in office as a result. He was not a detailed manager. He wasn't a micromanager. His approach was very much laissez-faire. In foreign policy, which is what presidents are supposed to lead in, he was distinctly anti-communist. He very much wanted to be sure the Soviet Union was blunted. And although it wasn't his personal actions that caused the wall to come down, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall, the Soviet Union had other problems that they were bumping into, which helped make that occur. It was very clear that that was Reagan's point of view to make that happen. His foreign policy was very clear during the first 4 years. Now, let's focus on an element that Reagan is often described with. Pick your term, intellectually weak, not intellectually gifted, not particularly good at study or understanding complex issues. That's something that Reagan is saddled with. His legacy sounds like that. I want you to write down, if you're interested further in Reagan, the title of a book. It's called Reagan, A Life. It's written by H.W. Brands, B-R-A-N-D-S. It is a biography of Reagan from birth until death, but most of it covers the governorship, but most is about the presidency. And I learned the following story about Reagan from Brands's history. Now, Reagan wanted to have a summit meeting with Gorbachev. He wanted to have the leader of our country meet with the leader of the Soviet Union. He wanted to reach some agreements about arms reduction, constraint on missiles, and he wanted to do that. He spent months studying. He talked to all the experts in the State Department. He brought back representatives who had been stationed at Moscow, who had worked with Soviet leadership, who understood what the Soviets did, and he studied it When he goes for those meetings, he is prepared, and remember I mentioned he was a good negotiator. He is prepared, and he sits down with Gorbachev, and over a series of what are going to be 4 summits, the 4th one doesn't count so much because it's kind of a victory lap in Moscow, but the 3 summits, he is prepared, he is focused, and he gets what he wants in the negotiation. He is asked about that later by a political reporter in Washington, and the reporter says, well, Mr. President, weren't you kind of in awe about Gorbachev because he's a trained engineer, et cetera? And Reagan said, no, because Gorbachev's a politician like I am. I was prepared and I knew how to talk to him. So although it is possible that Reagan may not have been the smartest president we ever had, and I don't think he was, actually, it's possible the smartest president we've ever had we're going to talk about today, and that's Clinton, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. But when that was important to him, he prepared, he focused, he was willing to let other people help him prepare, and he was very successful doing that. His first 4 years in office are wonderful in turn. Now, when I say wonderful, I'm not talking whether you agree with his politics, in terms of how a president operates, how a president works with Congress, and how a president accomplishes most of their agenda. It's a very successful first term as president. Then we get to his second term. Now, we know that after Reagan left the presidency, he announced that he had Alzheimer's, and we know that Alzheimer's was the cause of his death. The question which will never be fully answered is, at what point, if at all, did Alzheimer's begin to express itself during his second term? Because his second term was not effective at all. Iran-Contra began to bubble to the surface because he wasn't paying attention. We notice that his staff, his inner circle, starts to protect him. He doesn't have as many press conferences. The press conferences are shorter. There are some scripted questions in the press conferences. He's not allowed to go and have off-the-cuff meetings with reporters one-on-one like presidents like to do and get softball questions that they can answer and look presidential. His staff starts to protect him. When Iran-Contra starts to break apart, Reagan is not answering questions from the press. He will stand in front of a lectern and say, the person who's going to speak today is going to be Ed Meese, my attorney general, and then leaves the room. This is not the president who was there for the first 4 years, which raises the question that we will never have an answer to, which is it possible that Reagan should have stepped away from office during his second term? We have an amendment. The amendment is the 25th Amendment, which sets up the circumstances by which the vice president, which would have been, of course, George H.W. Bush, and a majority of the cabinet can make a statement where they think the president's not capable of fulfilling his office. Is it possible that should have been done? We will never know. And even Brands in his biography says it's an uncertain question. We just know the behaviors changed and Reagan wasn't as engaged as he had been before. It's important for the evolution of the presidency to know and to have confidence that if a president in office, for whatever reason, a stroke like Woodrow Wilson had, a possible onset of Alzheimer's, as Reagan may have had, that if that takes place, that we have a way that the president can be respectfully but appropriately informed that they have to step aside. Now, it's commonplace that a president goes under an operation, is under anesthetic, they sign away and the vice president's in charge for a few hours. We're used to that. But I'm talking about something more significant. And it's possible that should have taken place then, but it did not. The laissez-faire attitude that Reagan had in managing allowed Iran-Contra to take place. And after the scandal broke, and after the Tower Commission did its exhaustive research into how in the world did this happen, and they released their report, Reagan doesn't do a press conference. He does a speech from the Oval Office. And he says to the American people, and this is almost sad when you listen to it, he said, you know, American people, you know that I'm always optimistic and I look for things that are positive. And I had to read a lot of this report before I found something positive. And Reagan says, I believe it is positive that Senator Tower and the other people in the Tower Commission all agreed that President Reagan, myself, did not know that this was taking place. I did not mislead you. I didn't lie about it. I didn't know. Think about that for a minute. That's the most positive thing Reagan could find in the report. He didn't know because of his laissez-faire style, and it's possible he didn't know because he didn't quite have that capability that he had earlier on. He was a spokesman for conservatism. He was a spokesman in his first term for a strong presidency. That kind of recedes during his second term because he's not an engaged leader, I'm afraid, anymore. His vice president, George H.W. Bush, becomes president. And George H.W. Bush does something for the presidency, which is, I think, admirable, and for which I hope he is remembered more than his read my lips, no new taxes. We all say things that we're embarrassed about later on. And that might be one of the things that HW is embarrassed about. But let's talk about what he did that was so significant. Presidents can declare war, as you know, but the Congress has to agree to it. But Bush was confronted with Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait. And it was a violation of Kuwait's sovereignty. And Bush wanted to take action, but he took action in a consensus form. And this is interesting in terms of how Bush conducted the presidency. What we have found out since then is that Bush, before the Kuwait incident, made it a focus of his presidency to call, he loved to use the telephone, to call leaders of other countries around the world and just talk to them. Even if there wasn't a particular burning issue to talk about, he did that because he wanted to establish a relationship. Now, Bush certainly knew a whole lot of political leaders. He had been our ambassador to the UN. He had been a vice president for 8 years. He had been in charge of the CIA. He certainly was a knowledgeable person, but it was his style to say, I want to get to know people one-on-one, and I'm going to call people and we're going to talk just so we can get to know each other. When Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, now Bush is calling for a different reason. Now he is calling to line up people in a consensus format so that when we have the first Gulf War, it's not the US acting by itself. The US, ever since World War II, does not help itself internationally when it makes a decision unilaterally that military action should be taken. That is not good for our prestige. It's not good for national leadership. I'm not saying that action shouldn't be taken in certain cases. I'm saying that presidents who are more understanding of the process are more willing to build a consensus. It's not as satisfying because it is viscerally satisfying to take immediate military action and show that you can do something. But it's better to build a consensus and have other nations moving with you. And Bush was willing to do that. He built a consensus, including within Arab nations. He asked the Arab nations to take a vote, and almost half of them agreed with supporting the US in removing Saddam Hussein and pushing him back out of Kuwait. Half of the Arab nations agreed with that. Why? Bush had established a personal relationship with them. Now, we can laugh and we can joke about, is it really important that leaders of countries should get along with each other? Well, it's probably not important that they get along, but it is important that they know each other, that they understand each other. And Bush was a big believer in that. It helped when that took place. And there's a second thing that helped also, that I praise Bush for this, for this particular decision. Bush said to the group of countries that are going to support our effort in the first Gulf War, he said, our objective is to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. And when we do that, that's the end of our mission. Our mission is to get him out of Kuwait. We did. Norman Schwarzkopf and the first Gulf War, and they pushed him out. If you remember, the general media orientation at the time, as well as a lot of pressure from Congress, which was, hey, Saddam Hussein's a bad guy. We've got him on the run. We clearly dominated his military to get him out of Kuwait. Why stop there? Why not go all the way to Baghdad and get rid of him? Because he's dangerous. And Bush said, no. Our objective was to get him out of Kuwait. He's out of Kuwait. We're done. That is a lesson in international diplomacy that many presidents have failed at, which is they have gone into places without knowing what the definition is of success. What is the end point? How do we know if we're done? And if you want a contrast to that, we can go to Bush's son, who went into Afghanistan for a good reason, supported by NATO nations, by the way, to try to capture Osama bin Laden. We are still in Afghanistan. It is the longest running war in American history. Bush put us in. Obama allowed us to stay in. Trump allowed us to stay in. Whether or not we've increased or decreased the number of troops isn't the point. The point is we're still there, because when the second Bush put us in there, there wasn't a definitive definition of how do we know when we're done. Osama bin Laden died a number of years ago, and we are still in Afghanistan. H.W. Bush deserves praise for saying, we're going to take action. It's the right thing to do. We're going to do it with a group of like-minded countries. Here's the definition of success. When we achieve success, we're done. Now, whether or not you agree or disagree with the decision to do that, I'm talking about the process that he used to reach the decision and to provide leadership. So although C-SPAN puts him as a ranking of 20th out of 43, which is just a tick above average, because of that foreign policy success, I'm going to, in my informal rankings, I would boost him a bit higher, because presidents are responsible for our foreign policy. He got along with Congress. He worked well with Congress. He didn't try to usurp them in any particular way. His selection of a vice president was kind of strange, but not terribly important. In any case, so his presidency reminded us of how a leader expressing the desires of the United States on the international stage should act. And by the way, Congress supported him in this, how a president should act. Some domestic mistakes in terms of that tax thing that I talked about pulled him down, so he wasn't successful when he ran for re-election. But he certainly followed in the mold of Reagan's first term of how a president should act, work with the Congress, express the power of the presidency in a positive way. So at the moment, we're on a roller coaster. We have Carter, which we would define as maybe down here. We have Reagan's first term. We have Reagan's second term. We have Bush's only term. We're going to stay here for Clinton's first term, by the way. Let's go to Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton is ranked by C-SPAN as our number 15 president. Pretty high out of the 43 former presidents that we've had. If we were to look at Clinton, we again have the difference in two administrations, his first term in office and his second term in office. Let's be frank. Clinton has a character weakness. There's a number of words that might describe it. It's the weakness that led him to have the arrangement with an intern in the Oval Office. It is a character weakness. The stories of Clinton that I have read indicate that it was a reason that Hillary was not certain if she wanted to marry him because she already knew that he had this character weakness. He's not the first president to have this particular character weakness. It's going to affect the second term. At the same time, he is unquestionably brilliant. Now, I don't know how many of you do crossword puzzles. I actually build crossword puzzles for my grandchildren. It's kind of fun to do that. And then I challenge them with words that they know or people they know from Disney movies they know, and I put them into the crosswords. It's kind of fun to do it. And it takes a certain amount of vocabulary to do that. Clinton is the one who on Sundays does the New York Times crossword, which is totally blank. So you've got to fill in the word, you've got to get it right, and you've got to figure out where the next word is based upon the clues. And he has also designed crossword puzzles for the New York Times. Anybody who can do that is brilliant. Okay, having made that mention, that doesn't transmit into my brilliance is going to overcome my character weakness. And so we have the two terms of Clinton. In the first term, he is successful. He gets a lot done, and probably the crowning achievement, at least from my point of view, there's two crowning achievements. The first one is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was started, by the way, under George H.W. Bush and his ambassador to Mexico, John Negroponte, who did most of the work, because most of the work in NAFTA had to do with Mexico. They did most of the work. They didn't quite get it done. It carries over to Clinton. Clinton gets it over the goal line, to use a sports analogy, gets it over the goal line, fights against Democrats in Congress who think it is going to be a bad idea, but gets it signed. And if you look at the economics of NAFTA, it was a fine agreement that benefited all three countries. It benefited Mexico the most because Mexico's economy had the most room for improvement. But Clinton understood that. He got it through Congress and he signed it. And he brought Bush to the signing ceremony, which I think was appropriate to do that. Clinton also works with Newt Gingrich. By the way, would you ever name your child Newt? Sorry, that was just a random comment. Anyway, he works with Newt Gingrich to produce a balanced budget. Now, that doesn't mean that we took away the deficit that we had, but at least for 2 years, they construct a balanced budget. Now, they don't agree on everything. They actually shut down the government for a while, but they do have a balanced budget. And Clinton finds a way to work with him. And that's significant because Clinton was capable of doing that when he was focused on the things that he should be doing. He focused on welfare reform, which was an important step in terms of changing how federal welfare was determined. A very successful first term, successful working with Congress, successful accomplishing what he wanted to do. His character weakness continues, and in his second term, not only does it cause him a personal problem, he is impeached, but it also hurts the United States. During Clinton's second term, we have the we have the attack on the USS Cole, which blows a hole in the side of the Cole and kills some number of sailors. The group that was responsible for that was Al-Qaeda, which is Osama bin Laden, because they are already planning attacks on the US. We also have the attack on an embassy in Africa that kills a couple hundred Americans. Clinton was not focused on those issues because he was focused on saving his presidency, because by then the Whitewater investigation had lost steam and Ken Starr suddenly found out about a blue dress. You know where that goes. So Clinton now spends a year fighting to maintain his presidency. We have lived through another one of these events with President Trump. And as you saw, when that takes place, when a president faces impeachment, there's very little else that's discussed and very little else that gets done, because it is an all-consuming activity. For Clinton, it consumed him, and I understand why it did. But there are developments going on elsewhere in the world, and those developments needed the attention of the president, and Clinton couldn't give it because he was, in essence, trying to save himself and save his presidency. That was a shame that that took place. It is the result of that character weakness that I talked about. If Clinton had performed in his second term at the level of competence that he did in his first term, I have no doubt that Clinton's ranking would be probably top 10. But it wasn't. It was the Reagan syndrome for a different reason. Reagan's, I think, was illness. First term, great. Second term, not so much. Clinton proved he could work with Congress. That's a key step. He did well in terms of our image around the world. He focused our attention on the ethnic cleansing going on in Kosovo and called on NATO to supply the military force to end that, to stop that ethnic cleansing and save that region. Capable of doing very great things. But there was character weakness, and it got in the way. It's very frustrating when you talk about a president who is so good here and not so good here. It's like the Lyndon Johnson story all over again, with domestic Johnson and international Johnson. Bill Clinton leaves office. And by the way, there's a carryover from Clinton to George W. Bush, indirect carryover, if you will. When Al Gore decides that he wants to run for president in 2000, and Gore has been Clinton's vice president for 8 years, Gore has to make a decision. And the decision is, do I run as Clinton's vice president and support Clinton's policies, which are generally effective? The economy did very well during Clinton's presidency, and presidents love economies that do well. Or do I, Al Gore, distance myself from Clinton because of that character weakness? Well, Gore chose to distance himself. And by doing so, he removed an incredibly effective campaigner from his campaign. That would be Clinton. You may be aware, and if not, I will remind you, that during the time of the impeachment of Clinton, from when it was first announced until the Senate trial was done and Clinton was not convicted, if you will, Clinton's popularity rating in this country went up. It went up during that period of time. The American people made an evaluation based on the public opinion polls, and they said, what you did was despicable, but it's between you and your wife. As president, you've got our support. Clinton, it's frustrating. Clinton could have built on that and had much more success. And had he done that and not had that one incident that caused him to be impeached, Gore could have run with him, much as George H.W. Bush ran on the successes of Reagan that people remembered and led him to the presidency. Remember how paper thin that election was, and Gore may have been elected president. So Clinton not only changed his historical legacy, it's possible that he affected the chance of Gore to become president as well. George W. Bush. His presidency was hijacked and is defined by 9/11. And even if Gore had been elected, 9/11 would have happened. It had been planned for a couple of years. It was going to take place. Who the American president was irrelevant to Al-Qaeda. It was an attack on the United States. Bush just happened to be president. And therefore, what he wanted to accomplish in the presidency was hijacked, because now America is under attack. And now we have a president who needs to defend the country, which leads to the war on terror. I want to make a comment about George Bush in contrast to Clinton. I talked about Clinton's character weakness. I want to talk about Bush. When Bush was a younger man, certainly before he married and shortly after he married, Bush had a deserved reputation as a party person, as a person who drank too much, who caroused too much, and he had that reputation with him. His business that he had in Texas was failing in part because he wasn't managing it fairly well. And with the help of his wife, he stopped drinking totally. He went through a religious conversion and became a different person. Now, whether or not you like his politics, I find that an admirable accomplishment for any person to say, you know what, I don't like how my life is going, and I need to make some basic changes. I'm going to stop drinking, I'm going to find religion, and I'm going to be a new person, which Bush did. I am someone who, as many of you know, went through a religious conversion. It requires a degree of focus, a certain belief. In my case, it took a few years to do that, but I did. And it's a significant thing in someone's life. I did it on my own, not because anyone asked me to. But when Bush did that and stopped drinking, in essentially a dual decision, that says a lot about strength of character. Now, again, George W. is not going to be associated with the brilliance of a Bill Clinton. I understand that. But he's very practical. Unfortunately, how we evaluate him goes through the prism of 9/11. There's no way we can look at him otherwise. His rating is 33 out of 43 in C-SPAN. So he's down in the bottom third, if you will. Bottom third of our president. So he doesn't get very good marks. The war against terror, by the way, is also still going on, as is the war in Afghanistan. But Bush reacted to the nation being attacked. We hadn't been attacked like that since Pearl Harbor. And it was a surprise, and it caused a lot of fear. All of us, I suspect, can remember where we were and what we thought on 9/11 and how frightened we all were in terms of why, where, how come, what do we do, etc. Bush did the best he could to lead a response, and to his credit, he also involved the Congress in reacting to this, creating the Department of Homeland Security, asking for the authority to go after bin Laden and those sorts of things. And he worked with Congress, but Congress was afraid too. Just like when FDR asked for a declaration of war and the support of Congress after December 7th, 1941, when Bush asked for support, he gets it as well. And his focus becomes that. There is a lot of speculation about the degree to which Dick Cheney influenced George W. Bush's presidency. And there is no question that Cheney was more hawkish and had some influence on Bush. But presidents are responsible for their decisions. And even if that was a principal advisor, Bush is still the president. That's what we're talking about, are presidents. He allowed Cheney to influence. He allowed Rumsfeld to influence him, etc. So he is responsible for that. The war on terror is a very dangerous thing. If you remember the details of the war on terror, they included the Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act reduced the privacy and reduced the civil rights that we have in this country. You could argue that it was necessary. Well, you might argue that it was not necessary. But as often happens when there is a crisis and we feel we are under attack, we have to be careful to defend our liberties. And the proposal of those actions reduced our liberties a bit. And the war on terror is still going on. Also, it allowed some of our privacy to be invaded without our knowledge. That was the famous, all of the phone carriers had to give information to the government so that they could start looking for patterns of who might be terrorists. Did that make us safer? Don't know. I don't feel that it did, but anyway, that was the argument at the time. Bush supported that, and it affected his entire presidency. When we get to the issue with Iraq, and we get to the second Iraq war, I don't know if he felt that he had to avenge his father because his father didn't go after Saddam Hussein. Was the attack on Iraq based partly on oil? It was. But if you study, this particular point is important. If you study the way that the CIA and George Tenet, who was in charge of the CIA at the time, gave information to Bush about whether or not Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, it is a surprising example of behavior which is reminiscent of Reagan's in his second term. Bush clearly wanted to go after Saddam Hussein. Okay, we understand that. And the CIA is providing information which turns out not to be well sourced and not to be credible. Before Saddam Hussein was executed, during interviews that took place after he was sentenced and before he was executed, Hussein admits, he said, we never had weapons of mass destruction. We talked about it because we wanted to scare the United States and scare some other countries in the region. We never had those. It would have been helpful if the CIA knew that, and if the CIA had advised Bush of that, as opposed to the information they gave him, which led Colin Powell to make that embarrassing presentation at the UN. Bush should have been more detailed in terms of, you're giving me this information, I want it to be multi-sourced. You're giving me a single source. I want it to be absolutely true, because if I commit the United States in response to this, I need it to be right. Well, it wasn't right. Now, we can pat ourselves on the back that we got rid of a bad man. We look around the world, there's a lot of bad men in the world. Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela's name pops into my mind. But that doesn't mean that we can go and kill him because he's a bad guy. That's not the way the world works. So Bush ends up getting tied up in that. And then we have Katrina, and we have Bush's less than sterling response to that, as almost as if he wasn't quite sure how to react. And by the time we get near the end of his second term, his effectiveness just isn't really very good, I'm afraid. We will never know how good of a president he could have been because of 9/11. It hijacked his presidency. It affected the things he made decisions about. And his presidency simply wasn't as effective as it could have been, I suspect, as a result. We are still learning about the Bush presidency. And I hope that Colin Powell writes in more detail about what he experienced. I hope Condoleezza Rice writes in more detail, she hasn't yet, about what she experienced and what she observed. We learn a lot about former presidents from members of their inner circle who feel comfortable talking about what took place. So we know from James Baker, for example, about details of working with Reagan, that sort of stuff. Remember, I mentioned at the start of the lecture that of the program today, that when we get to the last couple of presidents, it's hard to talk about them. First, because it's too immediate. And second, because we don't have as much information as we have about presidents that are further in the past. So how do we define Bush's impact on the evolution of the presidency? The US was attacked. He He rallied the United States in terms of defending the country. He went after the perpetrators, Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, as he perceived them to be. He pursued them, as we expect, but he also introduced legislation that affected our rights, and he then listened to the CIA as opposed to questioning them. When Tenet leaves office, by the way, the person who takes over in terms of leadership internally in the FBI, by the way, is the man who led the study of Trump during his first couple of years of administration, Mueller. And it is interesting, by the way, to read about the way Mueller tried to give Bush accurate information and triple sourced it and tried to be a reliable source for him. It's an interesting sub-story. It's not part of today's lecture, but it's an interesting sub-story because Mueller and Bush had a couple of confrontations where Mueller said, you may not like to hear this, but this is what's going on. This is the truth. This is what I am strongly recommending you do. Presidents need to hear that. One of the worst things a president can have surrounding them is people who go, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, as opposed to people who question, like in Lincoln's cabinet, where he had people who questioned him. So we will never know how good or bad George Bush may have been because of what happened to 9/11. And then we elect Obama. That was a milestone for us. That was the first non-white person we have elected as president. Haven't quite gotten to that first female yet. We will, but at least we got over the hurdle of a non-white president, and that is a good thing. The first thing I want to do about Obama is to correct a perception about Obama, and you heard it a lot in the political news during his time as president. Let's talk about executive orders. Those things that presidents sign that have the force of law when they are president, but which can be reversed by the next president. Let's give you an example. President Obama signed an executive order which put us into the Paris Climate Accord. Now, he could have, as many other nations did, regard Paris as a treaty opportunity. And he could have gone to the Senate and said, I want you to approve our involvement as a treaty relationship. Now, remember your civics. That means that 2/3 of the Senate has to approve whatever the treaty proposal is, just the way Truman had to present it to the Senate when we joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Well, Obama's perception was that he wasn't going to convince 2/3 of the Senate to support him. So the way around that is to have us join as part of an executive order. We're going to join the Paris Climate Agreement. Okay, fine. When Obama leaves office and the next person comes into office, which is Trump, Trump can then say, totally legally, we are withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement because it was only an executive order. When President-elect Biden becomes president, he has the option of saying, with another executive order, okay, we're going to go back in again. Presidents can do that. The power of an executive order, it's not unlimited. You can't do something that's against the Constitution, but it's a really powerful thing that a president can do. It is equivalent perhaps to the right to give pardons to people, which is also something that presidents have the right to do. But I'm talking about executive orders. There is a perception that Obama signed more executive orders than any other president in history. Well, let's look at the statistics and kind of get rid of that one. What American president signed the most executive orders on an annual basis? Now, presidents serve different lengths in office, right? But which president signed the most executive orders per year of their presidency? The winner is, drum roll, the winner is Franklin Roosevelt, who signed an average of 308 executive orders each year during his presidency. He is far and away the leader. Where does Obama rank? 23rd among 43 former presidents, signing an average of 35 a year. The fact that many people said Obama is signing all of these executive orders is a symptom of something called polarization. We're almost going to get to polarization because it is affecting the evolution of the US presidency. By the way, the question is probably formed in your mind, where does President Trump rank on executive orders? And the answer is, unless he has a big flurry of them in the next, few weeks, he ranks 16th, which would be about the upper third roughly. He has averaged 46 a year, a few more per year than Obama. So we need to correct that in terms of Obama, in terms of the number of executive orders. In terms of the evolution of the presidency, Obama is going to be the example of the period of time, or the moment is more correct, of the moment where gridlock settled on Washington, where the differences in our politics became more and more extreme than they had been before. At the end of Obama's first 2 years in office, where the Republicans retook the Senate, and the Republican majority leader said, "My goal is to make Obama a one-term president." That's a quote, by the way. He was unsuccessful at that. But it did set up the environment of polarization, which since then has only become worse. It is something that I deal with on a daily basis in my professional life, talking about politics and talking about foreign policy. The degree to which we are polarized is painful. Have we been polarized before? We have been at various times with certain presidents. Obviously, leading up to the Civil War, we were certainly polarized. But in terms of modern times, since 1900, if you will, our level of polarization at the moment is as bad as it has ever been. And the outcome of polarization is a lack of progress unless one party can bludgeon the other into submission. Give you two examples. First, Obama's first 2 years in office, he has a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House. What does he achieve? He achieves the Affordable Care Act, which is called Obamacare. Now, whether you think that is a good thing or a bad thing, we're talking about process and we're talking about the evolution of the presidency. He controls both houses. It's important to him to try to make our healthcare system better. We have in our family, we have a child that has a lifelong medical condition that cannot be cured, and it is therefore a pre-existing condition for this child. And I remember Carol crying when the Affordable Care Act was passed, because now that child of ours can never be turned down for insurance because of pre-existing condition. It's a big thing in our family that happened. And it got through Congress because the Democrats were in control of both houses and the presidency. Presidents can be really effective. Did Obama work with or try to work with the Congress? He did. But when the Senate flipped over to the Republicans, he lost that. And McConnell made the comment that he made. Fast forward, 2016, Donald Trump is elected president. He has a Republican House. He has a Republican Senate. What happens in his first 2 years? We pass a major change to the tax code, major, that Trump had talked about. Again, whether you agree or disagree with politics, a president can get a whole lot done. But remember, that was passed pretty much on a party line basis, because Trump could, just like Obama could. Once that finished, and we had the midterms of Trump's first term in office, and the Democrats took the House, then that avenue was gone. Now, if you want to get legislation through, you've got to convince the other party to work with you. Now, we haven't seen a whole lot of that in the last 2 years with Trump, and we didn't see a whole lot of that in the last 6 years with Obama because of polarization, because of the belief which many people in Congress and many people like you and like me tend to have, which is the other party is evil, and we have the correct answer, and we don't need to compromise because compromise doesn't work. Well, you know what? Our entire system of government is based on compromise, and effective presidents are compromisers, which include Reagan, who we talked about today. Some people have said to me, well, it's not Obama's fault that, the McConnell blocked so many things Obama wanted to do. And I counter state back to them that effective presidents work with Congress that is opposed to them. Think of Reagan and Tip O'Neill as an example. Think of Lyndon Johnson as majority leader and Dwight Eisenhower as an example. The ability on a personal level to work with Congress, even if you don't agree with them, even if they're of the other party, becomes really important to achieving some amount of your goals. And if you don't do that, it's going to affect your presidency. Now, it takes two people to tango. It takes two people to reach an agreement, and I'm fully aware of that. So I'm not blaming one person as opposed to the other. I'm simply saying, since we're talking about the presidencies, that the ability to work. Now, you could say, wow, Trump working with Pelosi, wow, that's going to be difficult, and you're probably right. Not a whole lot different, perhaps, than Obama working with McConnell. But at the moment, when Biden becomes president, he's going to have to work with Congress. We don't know what Congress is going to be constituted because there's an election coming up in Georgia, which I'm sure you're aware of. And that's getting ahead of our topic anyway. I need to spend more time on Obama and Trump's presidency. The evolution of the presidency as the leader of our nation and an effective office includes working with Congress. If you can't work with Congress, you're not going to be as effective as you could have been. You're not going to get your agenda accomplished. We've seen it with Obama and we've seen it with Trump. I wish I were smart enough to know exactly what the cause is so that I could advocate working against it, but I'm not that smart. I can see it, I can describe it, but I can't look at the cause of it. And I can certainly see that it has impact on my country and on the presidency. Back to Obama. There were two things that characterized Obama's 2 terms in office. The first was a reliance on what's called the international liberal order or internationalism, the belief that we need to join organizations, we need to be active in those organizations, that international trade is going to be helpful for us, and we need to focus on international issues. Secondly, the growth of the bureaucratic state. Now, notice I use the term bureaucratic state, not deep state. Deep state is a very dangerous term to use, but bureaucratic state is certainly fair. Federal government has 900,000 employees. That's a pretty large group. That's across all the agencies. That's 900,000 employees. And the president, in a sense, is responsible, obviously not day-to-day management, because that's head of the executive branch. If the president suggests to the Congress, and the Congress agrees, and passes legislation which is loosely worded, which isn't real specific, and says, okay, government agency, you interpret the details of this. We've kind of given you an overall law, and the president signed it, by the way, so you go in and interpret the details. The president and the Congress are giving away some of their authority to the bureaucrats who are going to have to interpret government employees, because bureaucrat sometimes sounds like it has an edge to it. Government employees who have to implement these particular laws. Better to be specific. President's responsible for that. President can say to Congress, you know what, this law needs to be more specific. You gave me a law which is fuzzy, so I'm going to veto it, write it again, and then maybe I'll sign it. It's not something that President Obama did very much. Obama's 2 terms in office finish, and we elect President Trump as president. We are near the end of the Trump presidency. It is way too immediate for us to talk about in terms of impact on the presidency, except in 2 ways that we can certainly make a comment. First, the concept of America first, the concept of being more relatively isolated than we had been under Obama is a change in direction. And that change in direction is consistent with various periods of time in our history. It's consistent with the Republican Party of the late 40s. It's consistent with the Republican Party of the late 20s, as a matter of fact, in terms of we can pull back from world leadership, if you will, and focus more on ourselves. Good or bad, again, depends upon your politics, but that certainly is a change. And the Congress has let that happen without too much of a pushback internationally. Remember, Constitution gives president the ultimate authority in terms of where our foreign policy goes. That is a distinct change. Is that an evolution of the presidency? I don't think so. I think it is just this current president, because the signals from Biden are fairly clear that he wants to go back into a direction more similar to what Obama did in terms of international connections and reaching out. But here's the thing that I find interesting about talking about Trump compared to other presidents. In working with MBA students, which I do, when we get to leadership classes, we go through the analysis of the 5 classical styles of leadership. Now, the 5 classical styles, whether you lead a country, you lead a major corporation, you lead a village, you're a mayor of a village, these are the 5 classical leadership styles of an entity. And I find this interesting. You may have heard about this before. I wrote about it a few years ago, but I want to review it for you now, because it's an important way to remember the Trump presidency. The first style is laissez-faire, which is I'm in charge, but I'm pretty much going to let all of you guys do what you want to do and, kind of follow my general direction, but I'm not going to manage details. The president who fits that category is Ronald Reagan. The second leadership style is called consensus. I know I make the decisions, but I want to gather smart people with me, and I want to work together. So when I make the decision, it represents pretty much all of my advisors. Obviously, that's Abraham Lincoln, and it's also John Kennedy during his time in office. The third is autocratic, which is we're going to do it my way. And if you don't like it, really too bad. We're going to do it my way, and I'm going to make the decisions. And that is Richard Nixon. For good or for bad, that's Richard Nixon. The fourth style, which is fairly uncommon, is called transformational. And that's a leadership style that says, I'm going to take this, whatever this is, and I'm going to change it. I'm going to make it really different. And I'm going to lead you into a transformation. Franklin Roosevelt was a transformational president. Theodore Roosevelt was a transformational president. What the country and the government looked like when they started versus when they ended, very different, and different by design. The fifth leadership style is called transactional. And we've never had a president before who was a transactional leader until Donald Trump. Transactional leader very much believes on one-on-one. I'm going to do something for you, you're going to do something for me, or I'm going to force you to do something for me because I'm more powerful. I believe in one-on-one diplomacy. I'm going to go visit Kim Jong-un. I'm going to go visit Xi Jinping because that's how it should be done, one-on-one. And I'm going to do something if you do something for me. It's called transactional. It's not a bad leadership style. It's just a style that we aren't used to seeing in our chief executive. Is that going to continue? No. Biden very clearly, my opinion, but is probably going to fall into the consensus sort of style, which is I've got these people, I'm going to listen to them, we're going to try and make decisions together and go forward. So I would predict that he will be consensus style. So the 4 years that we are concluding with the current president, where we've had the America First and we've had transactional, seem to be associated just with that president. And President-elect Biden will give us a different view. Unfortunately, though, the polarization, which began from my point of view during Obama's presidency, whoever you want to blame for it is not important, it's there, got worse during the Trump presidency. The reasons, again, depend upon your politics. But we now have gone through a 12-year period, 8 years of Obama, literally, or give him 6 years, and then 4 years of Trump, so call it 10 years, where the polarization is really, really painful, gets in the way of our country as well as the evolution of the presidency. How can anyone work through that? There is only one way to do it at the level that we're talking about with the presidency, and that is to reach across the aisle and say, we need to find some common ground, and we need to find it quickly because there's a whole lot of things that need to be fixed in this country. You know that as well as I do. And they're going to get fixed if we work across the aisle, because if we only work on things, if we control the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and now we can ram stuff through, that's not necessarily satisfactory. It doesn't make the American people happy. So we have to reach across the aisle, because most of the time, one of the two houses is not going to be the same party as the president, and we're going to be in the two-party system for a while. So it's, in my mind, it is up to the president to say, I need to work across the aisle, which in the next administration might be, we don't know based on Georgia, might be Biden and McConnell working together. Now, you might be sitting at home going, that's not going to happen. Well, hang on a little bit and let's see what happens, because that's the dynamic that needs to take place to break through this sort of gridlock that we have been experiencing for this length of time, where we only pass stuff if we can jam it down the throat of the other party. I hope that our future presidents are more willing to do that. If they are, then we can make some progress. I want to remind you of that question that I posed somewhere in the first 10 minutes of the session today, which is, what is the role of Congress? It would be helpful to our governance style if Congress remembered that it has actually a whole lot of authority based on our Constitution, which it doesn't always fully use. That would be handy to provide some balance to the president. President doesn't have to be the imperial president. Congress has a role, and I hope that they reassert themselves. But I also want my president, whoever that might be, to reach across the aisle and work with the other party, whoever the other party is, because that's better for our form of government to do that. And by golly, we have reached the end of 2020. Many of us are happy about that. And the end of this 6-part program. I want to take a moment to thank the Schaumburg Library for supporting this particular program, because devoting a full year to a topic is, to me, very gratifying to me, but also very nice that the library would do that. And I'm also looking forward to next year when we do the Civil War and do a similar sort of program. Annie, I'm going to go take a quick look at Q&A and chat and see if there's anything in there. As you know, if someone asks anything on YouTube, I can't do anything with that, but I can go into Q&A and let's go there. Okay. The recent 4-part series on the Reagans had nothing positive to say about the man or his presidency. Can you shed any light on why that is? Okay, first of all, I don't watch TV. Haven't watched TV in close to 11 years. So I have no idea. I mean, I know what Showtime is, but I didn't watch it. If there was nothing positive to say, my assumption, and I have no knowledge here, my assumption would be that the people who produced it had a bit of an agenda or an axe to grind, because it's unfair to say that there was nothing positive about the Reagan presidency. I just don't think that's historically fair. So I'm thinking, look at who the producer was or who funded it, and that may be a point of view thing. And I'm just guessing because I don't know. A good book to read that offers ideas about reducing partisanship is Love Your Enemies: How Decent People Can Save America from the Culture of Contempt by Arthur Brooks. I'm going to repeat that in case you're taking notes at home. Love Your Enemies by Arthur C. Brooks. I will mark that down myself to read because it is something that gnaws at me almost daily in terms of getting along with people that you disagree with. It is incredibly important for us as citizens, and we're not doing a good job over the last 10 years. Thank you. Someone asked, someone asked if there was any virtual cake. Well, if there were virtual cake, how would you taste it? So we're going to pass on that one. Is Trump's transactional management style derived from his business background versus being a politician? I believe that it is, by the way, because the real estate world in which President Trump grew up is very much transactional. Here's a piece of property, you get it or I get it. That's transactional, as opposed to let's work on a consensus sort of thing. So I suspect that affected the way he developed, yes. I'm going to pass on a question about pardoning. We're going to pass on that one. Imperial presidency start with McKinley. It officially started with Theodore Roosevelt. Had McKinley lived through his second term, I think we could say it started with him. I've been doing a lot of reading about McKinley recently. Two very good books, by the way. Because I'm be doing presentations about McKinley next year. I think had he finished his second term, based on what happened with the Spanish-American War and what he was doing in the Philippines, yes, that McKinley was going in that direction, but he died too soon, so it ended up on Theodore Roosevelt to do that. How do you rank presidents and their ability to bring the American people together? It is one of the 10 characteristics that C-SPAN looks at. And if you go to the C-SPAN website, which I've recommended each time we've done this program, that is one of the characteristics they talk about. And I think you might get some interesting insights in the way they rate presidents on that particular category. Where do you think that Trump will fall in the rating of US presidents? I haven't the faintest idea. No one has an idea. We do know, by the way, that C-SPAN has promised to do these rankings within a few months of every president leaving office. So by March or April of 2021, we can expect a preliminary rating. And no, I do not know where that's going to go. Do executive orders continue unless they are revoked by the next president? Yes, as a matter of fact, they are in effect and they take the place of law. But the frustrating thing about them is the next president can say, never mind, it's gone, and it's gone. So it's not that it only exists for the term of the president, it is that the next president can reverse it, which is frustrating to see. Okay, love your enemies. The second person has mentioned that. Let's swing over to chat. Let's see. Oh, we have a bunch of stuff from when the program was getting started. Okay, none of that is relevant now to that, and the sound has been corrected. And there, okay, we're done with that. Q&A, we're done. We're done with chat. Let me close that off. Okay, Annie, I think we're completely done.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Gary. I tried a new microphone, so hopefully you're able to hear me.
That's very nice. That's very good.
Perfect. Well, we don't have any questions on YouTube. We did just have a few more come in on the Q&A right as we were about to end.
I closed mine. You go ahead.
Yep. How many federal jobs are protected from removal by the president?
Roughly speaking, somewhere in the neighborhood of 85 or 90%. And that goes back to an interesting law that was proposed by James Garfield in terms of protecting this, creating and protecting civil servants. So it's only the top level jobs that change with a new administration. Something like 85 or 90% or possibly more are absolutely protected by civil service. But it's the leadership roles that can change with the president, or, the president can have effect on. It's a small portion, but it's a large number of people. Next.
And then we've got a thank you that came in, and
You're
then
welcome.
another comment. Reagan is often glorified, and perhaps deservedly, in so many instances. Not much on his policy flaws in the area of criminal justice laws and policies. And then another question, this one's for me. How many of these lectures are available on YouTube? So if you take a look at the email that I just sent out that had the attachment with the handout, there is a link in there to the programs that are available on YouTube. So you can watch volumes 2 through 6 on YouTube. Volume 1 was before the pandemic, so we did not have that one recorded, but you can catch up on the other.
Was there a time before the pandemic? Was there?
What was
before
that?
The pandemic? Was it really? I almost forgot, Annie.
There was a time before the pandemic.
Wow, okay.
Yep, but we've been in this for quite a while, so we do have all of those instances. And if you haven't had an opportunity to sign up for the Civil Rights series, it will be at the same time on Thursday afternoons every other month in 2021.
Or the Civil War series too.
Mm-hmm. Yes, pre-pandemic seems so very long ago, most definitely. But we'll be doing the Civil War series, so even if you can't attend live on those, please go ahead and register, because we will be sending out a link to view it. Those will not be available on YouTube because we will be using clips from like the critically acclaimed Ken Burns film on the Civil War, which will definitely add.
The superb movie Gettysburg, will be using a couple of clips from that.
Absolutely. Yep. So to avoid any copyright issues, we're going to make that one. If you register, you can view it live in Zoom, or you can watch it on your own time in Zoom. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Gary, and everyone. Have a happy New Year and happy holidays.
Okay. Bye, everybody. We'll see you next year.
And for Francine's last question, when you sign up for the Civil War series, those are one by one. So right now, the first one is available, and then I can send an email out to everyone that has registered for the first one when the second one does become available. But if you want to mark your calendars, I'll go ahead and send out the dates that we have for that onto the email that I sent for this. And that way you can mark your calendars. They're not available to sign up just yet, just because of the way that our calendar system works, but I can make an announcement every time that does get published. All right, thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your year.